Alan Watts was born at a time when the world was still rebuilding itself after the Great Wars, a period marked by a thirst for meaning and the search for new references that could fill the void left by the spiritual and existential crisis of the West. His journey began in England, within a traditional education, but soon revealed a restless mind, eager to understand the mysteries of life beyond conventions. Watts grew up fascinated by philosophy, religion, and symbols, delving into Christian texts, but quickly realizing that there was something beyond the limits of Western thought. While still young, he discovered Zen and Taoism, and from that moment on, his life became a channel of translation between worlds, a living bridge between East and West. His move to the United States represented not only a geographical change, but also a cultural and spiritual one. In a country consolidating itself as an economic and military power, Watts found fertile ground to spread his ideas of expanded consciousness and ego transcendence. Through lectures and talks, he began to attract people hungry for new ways of seeing life, especially young people who no longer identified with the moral and religious rigidity they had inherited from their parents. Thus, his voice became one of the most influential of the counterculture, anticipating debates that decades later would become central to popular philosophy. Watts was not an academic in the traditional sense, although he studied theology and was ordained as an Anglican priest. His genius lay precisely in not being bound to dogma, but in questioning it, dismantling it, and reconstructing it with the lightness of a storyteller. He did not speak only to specialists. He spoke to everyone, turning complex ideas into accessible metaphors, narrating Zen as one would speak of a river, describing Tao as one who watches the wind move the leaves of a tree. This capacity for direct, poetic, and engaging communication made him a unique figure, closer to an itinerant master than to a conventional university professor. Throughout his life, Watts wrote dozens of books, recorded hundreds of lectures, and became a reference not only for scholars, but also for musicians, artists, therapists, and spiritual seekers. His legacy lies not only in his ideas, but in the style with which he conveyed them. He laughed at his own words, invited the audience not to believe him blindly, but to experience for themselves. For him, wisdom did not lie in accumulating theories, but in realizing that at its core life is a game, a cosmic dance in which each of us plays a fundamental role. Alan Watts, therefore, cannot be reduced to a mere philosopher or religious thinker. He was a translator of worlds, an interpreter of the human soul in search of meaning, someone who looked into the existential void and transformed it into music, metaphor, and laughter. His life, marked by excesses, contradictions, and brilliance, reflected exactly what he preached: the acceptance that chaos is part of order, that insecurity is the true ground of freedom, and that consciousness is an ocean in which we are all inevitably immersed. His biography is at once the story of a man and of an era, a response to the weariness of modernity and an invitation to rediscover the sacred in everyday life. Alan Watts stood out as one of the greatest interpreters of Eastern thought for the Western public in the 20th century, at a time when contact between cultures was still limited and marked by strong prejudices. While the West was rooted in a dualistic, rational, and scientific vision of reality, the East cultivated millennia-old traditions that spoke of unity, emptiness, and detachment. For many, these concepts were incomprehensible or even seen as too exotic, but Watts translated them with simplicity, clarity, and poetry, creating a true link between two ways of living and perceiving the world. His genius lay in taking ideas that might seem strange, such as the ego is an illusion, or life is a game with no final purpose, and explaining them in accessible metaphors, comparing them to a dance, a river, or the sound of music. This bridge that Watts built was not only intellectual but profoundly existential. He understood that the West had lost itself in its relentless pursuit of progress, results, and control, creating a culture of anxiety, alienation, and spiritual emptiness. By presenting Zen, Taoism, and Vedanta, Watts did not want his listeners to simply convert to Eastern traditions, but to understand what was universal in them, a wisdom that reminded them that life is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. This perspective opened space for thousands of people to find relief amid the weight of modern expectations, realizing they were not imprisoned by their social roles, their professional titles, or the masks imposed by society. Watts did not import cold concepts, he transmitted experiences. In his lectures he often quoted Zen masters, told Taoist parables or explored Indian sacred texts, but always in a fluid way, showing how these teachings could dialogue with the pains and dilemmas of those living in industrial cities, trapped by clocks and economic pressures. He made Eastern philosophy cease to be a distant set of religious doctrines and become a way of life, a new perspective on the everyday, an invitation to perceive the interdependence of all things. The impact of this work was profound, especially among the countercultural youth of the 1960s and 1970s, who sought an alternative to Western materialism and the wars that marked that generation. Watts became a kind of unofficial spiritual guide, someone who offered words of freedom amid the weight of rigid morality and rampant consumerism. By speaking of East and West as two faces of the same reality, he helped dissolve cultural and spiritual boundaries, inviting people to see that true wisdom has no homeland, but is universal. In the end, his bridge between the two traditions was not just a translation of ideas, but an act of reconciliation. He showed that East and West do not need to be seen as irreconcilable opposites, but as complementary, one offering rationality, science, and analysis, the other bringing intuition, silence, and contemplation. This integration gave the West a chance to look into the mirror of the East and perceive its own limitations, while revealing to the East the beauty of clear and accessible communication. Alan Watts, therefore, was the architect of a dialogue that forever changed modern spirituality. One of Alan Watts's most striking teachings is his view that the ego, that inner voice that says "I am," is nothing more than an illusory construction. For him, the belief in a fixed, separate, and solid self is the greatest source of human suffering. From an early age, we are conditioned to believe that we are isolated individuals with rigid boundaries that separate us from the world. However, Watts argued that this notion does not reflect reality. The ego, according to him, is merely a mental trace, a linguistic convention, a story we tell ourselves. And when we blindly believe in this story, we disconnect from the totality of life. Watts liked to use simple metaphors to explain this idea. He said that the ego is like a wave that believes it is separate from the ocean. The wave has form, a beginning and an end, but it does not exist outside the sea. In the same way, each human being has a particular identity, but it is not independent of the cosmos. It is only the temporary expression of something much greater. When the ego forgets its oceanic nature, fear, attachment, and the illusion of control arise. It is precisely this false separation that creates the constant anxiety of proving who we are, of defending a reputation, of accumulating possessions and titles to reinforce the idea of a self that, in practice, has never existed as a solid entity. This vision resonated deeply with the Eastern traditions that Watts studied and disseminated, especially Buddhism and Taoism. In Buddhism, the notion of Anatman teaches that there is no permanent self. In Taoism, the flow of life shows that everything is in transformation, and clinging to a fixed identity is like swimming against the current. Watts translated these ideas for a Western audience with almost poetic clarity, showing that abandoning the illusion of the ego does not mean denying individuality, but recognizing it as part of something greater, just as a tree is part of the forest and does not exist outside of it. By bringing this perspective, Watts also offered an antidote to the narcissism and alienation of modernity. He reminded people that the obsession with building a perfect identity is a trap, because the more we struggle to reinforce the ego, the more fragile and insecure we become. True freedom, he said, lies in realizing that we are not just the voice in our head, but the very flow of life manifesting through it. Instead of clinging to the character, we can relax and allow ourselves to live fully, without the constant need to justify our existence. This deconstruction of the ego also had a liberating effect at the collective level. By understanding that we are not separate but interconnected, the idea that life is a constant competition between me and others falls apart. This shift in perception creates space for compassion, for a sense of unity, and for a more harmonious relationship with nature. The ego, seen as an illusion, does not completely disappear, but it loses its tyrannical power. It becomes just a tool, a useful mask in some contexts, but not something that defines what we are in essence. This message, conveyed by Watts with humor, lightness, and depth, remains one of the most powerful keys to freeing consciousness from the burden of living in constant search for validation. For Alan Watts, life is neither a ladder to be climbed nor a race toward some glorious final point. Existence, he said, is not a problem to be solved, but a piece of music to be danced, a game to be played. This idea breaks with the Western logic of linear progress, where everything is measured in terms of objectives, goals, and future results. Watts reminded his audience that when we listen to a song, we do not anxiously await the last chord, just as in a dance, we do not aim to reach the corner of the room. The purpose is in the act of dancing itself, in the continuous movement that only makes sense while it happens. So it is with life. It is not about reaching a destination, but about being present in the flow of each moment. This metaphor of life as a dance brought relief to a society marked by performance anxiety and the constant pursuit of success. Watts said that we are deceived into believing that life is some sort of business journey, where we must accumulate achievements, money, and recognition, as if we were saving receipts that would one day be exchanged for a final reward. Yet, when we reach the end, we realize there was no prize at all, only the wasted time spent chasing something that had always been here. For him, this blind race creates frustration and suffering because it prevents us from savoring the only real thing we have, the now. In his lectures, Watts often invited his audience to reflect on human attitudes toward childhood and old age. He said that we look at children and think, one day they will grow up and have a real life, and we look at the elderly with pity, believing their life is already behind them. But the child is already living fully, playing, exploring, dancing. And the elderly, even with less time ahead, continue breathing and being part of the great cosmic dance. The tragedy, according to Watts, is that we spend most of our time postponing life in the name of a future that never arrives, forgetting that the only place it can be experienced is the present. The dance of life, therefore, is an invitation to lightness. It is not about irresponsibility, but about recognizing that the rigidity of living only for goals imprisons us. Watts reminded us that even the universe seems to dance. The stars spin in spirals, the planets orbit in cycles, the heart beats in rhythm, the breath flows back and forth, everything pulses in circular motion, and existence follows this infinite cadence. When we resist this natural dance, trying to control every step, we fall into the illusion of the ego that believes it is the conductor of the orchestra, when in reality we are only part of the melody. By rescuing this vision, Watts offered the West a new way of looking at life, not as a burden, not as an endless battle, but as art, as celebration. Living is playing an instrument in the symphony of the universe, without rushing to end the music, simply surrendering to the joy of playing. This teaching continues to echo, because it reminds us that life is not in the destination, but in the walking, not in the final note, but in the sound vibrating now. The dance of life is the liberation from the burden of having to arrive somewhere and the rediscovery of the beauty of simply being here. For Alan Watts, Zen was more than just an Eastern tradition. It was a direct path to experiencing reality without the incessant filters of thought. He realized that the West had turned the mind into an idol, a mechanism of analysis and control that rarely rested, creating a culture obsessed with explanations and rationalizations. Zen, on the other hand, proposed precisely the opposite, silencing the discursive mind so that life could be perceived in its totality. Watts described this experience not as an escape from the world, but as a deep immersion in it, where consciousness was freed from narratives and simply merged with the present moment. For Watts, Zen was not a set of dogmas to be memorized, but a practice of detachment from language itself. He loved telling Zen parables in which monks responded with laughter, blows or riddles that seemed absurd. These stories, far from being mere eccentricities, revealed the heart of Zen philosophy, the incapacity of the logical mind to grasp ultimate truth. Watts said that the mind is like a mirror clouded by an excess of concepts, and Zen serves to clean it, allowing reality to reflect with clarity. Silence, therefore, was not absence but full presence, a space in which life could reveal itself as it truly is, without filters. This silence of the mind did not mean emptiness in a negative sense, but rather a state of fullness in which the boundaries between subject and object disappeared. Watts explained that when someone is fully absorbed in an activity, whether painting, meditating, or simply watching the rain, There is no longer a clear division between I and what I do. This fusion was what Zen called satori, a kind of sudden awakening in which we realize that we have never been separate from the world. For a Western audience accustomed to seeing themselves as isolated entities, this idea was profoundly liberating. In translating Zen for the West, Watts did not treat it as an exotic religion, but as a practical invitation to experience. He said that Zen is not something to believe in, but something to live. It was a path of liberation from the tyranny of thoughts, the prison of the ego, and the illusion of time. This state of full attention, according to him, was available at every moment. It only required letting the mind grow quiet and allowing the heart to open to the natural rhythm of existence. Thus, Zen, in his view, did not require elaborate temples or complex rituals. All that was needed was silence, breath, and surrender to the present. This message resonated so powerfully that many, even without fully understanding all the formal aspects of Zen, found in his words a way to meditate on life with simplicity and clarity. For Watts, the silence of the mind was not the end, but the beginning of a life lived in authenticity, where each moment became a doorway to the sacred. Alan Watts also had a profound perception of time, which he described not as a straight line to be traveled from birth to death, but as an illusion that traps the human mind in a constant cycle of expectations. For him, one of the greatest tragedies of the West was the inability to live in the present, since people were always caught in memories of the past or projections of the future. The past became a burden of memories and regrets, while the future was treated as a vault of hopes, promises, and anxieties. In this way, real life, which exists only in the now, was ignored. Watts often pointed out that we live as if life were a kind of dress rehearsal for a performance that never happens. From childhood, we are taught to wait for the next step. First school, then university, a job, marriage, retirement. There is always a promise that real life will begin later. But when we finally look back, we realize we have been too busy waiting while life was already happening. This trap of expectation is what generates so much existential emptiness, because we always project ourselves into something that never fully materializes. In deconstructing this notion, Watts used a powerful metaphor, that time is like a river. The mistake of modern man is to try to hold water in his hands, while the real secret is to let it flow. The past is only the water that has already flowed under the bridge, and the future is the water that has yet to come. The only water that truly exists is the one touching our feet now. This simple metaphor revealed profound wisdom. Awareness of the present does not eliminate past or future, but it puts them in their proper places, as references and not as prisons. Watts also criticized the way Western society had transformed time into currency. Everything was measured in productivity, deadlines, and clocks. The value of life came to be calculated in hours of work, goals, and results, as if existence were a financial investment. But he reminded us that true wealth is not in accumulating years, but in living them with intensity and presence. A single moment lived fully could be more valuable than decades spent in automatism. This vision freed those who listened to him, as it showed that life does not need to wait for a special occasion. It is already happening here and now. With this, Watts invited each person to break free from the tyranny of psychological time. Living was not about waiting for a perfect future or lamenting a lost past. It was about diving into the eternity of the present moment, which had always been available. This liberation from the trap of expectation did not mean ignoring responsibilities or plans, but understanding that the future can only be built in the present, and that the only concrete reality is the breath we have now. For him, being fully aware of the moment was true spirituality, a path to reconciliation with life and with existence itself. Among Alan Watts's most fascinating ideas is his conception of the universe as a divine game, a kind of cosmic play, in which the whole fragments itself into countless forms to experience itself. For him, existence was not a rigid system with a final goal to be reached, but a spectacle of multiple faces in constant transformation. Watts compared life to a theater play in which God wears infinite masks, sometimes as human beings, sometimes as animals, trees, planets, or stars. The game consists of hiding and revealing, of forgetting oneself only to remember again, of living the drama of the separate self in order to then awaken to totality. This vision, strongly influenced by Hinduism and the concept of Leela, the divine play, showed that there was no ultimate purpose in the universe beyond the experience itself. The meaning of life was not about reaching some transcendent destination, but about living the infinite dance of creation. Just as a child plays for the sake of play itself, without worrying about a reward, the cosmos expresses itself for no other reason than to exist. For a Western audience accustomed to thinking in terms of sin, duty, and rigid purpose, this idea was revolutionary. Watts showed that life does not need justification. It is self-justified because the very act of being is already the reward. In his lectures, he liked to remind people that if God is omniscient and eternal, to live only as God would be tedious, predictable, and without surprise. So, according to this metaphor, the whole chooses to forget its infinity and dive into the limitation of being human, with all its pains, joys, and uncertainties. This temporary forgetfulness allows the game to exist, because without it, there would be no drama, no learning, no emotion. Yet the divine essence remains, always ready to be rediscovered. This perception transformed human anguish into something sacred, because even suffering was part of the great performance. Watts insisted that understanding the universe as a divine game does not mean falling into nihilism or irresponsibility. On the contrary, it is realizing that life does not need a suffocating moral weight to be lived fully. He said that the West's mistake was turning existence into hard labor instead of recognizing it as celebration. When we remember that we are part of a cosmic play, we can relax in the face of uncertainties, laugh at contradictions, and even accept death as a change of scenery rather than an absolute end. Excessive seriousness loses its meaning when we understand that we are dancing within a universal theater that never closes. In conveying this vision, Watts offered a spirituality of lightness, in which the divine is not distant but manifests in every instant of ordinary life. Eating, breathing, loving, crying, all of it is part of the sacred performance. To recognize the universe as a divine game is to rediscover that there is nothing outside the sacred, that everything is an expression of the whole playing with itself. This understanding does not eliminate life's challenges, but frames them in a broader perspective, where even pain gains meaning as part of the infinite melody. Alan Watts lived intensely through the cultural effervescence of the 1960s and 1970s, a period in which the counterculture explored new ways of perceiving the world and breaking through the limits of conventional thinking. In this context, psychedelia played a central role, and Watts not only followed this movement closely, but also reflected deeply on its spiritual and philosophical significance. He saw psychedelic substances not as mere recreational drugs, but as tools capable of opening doors of perception, allowing glimpses of states of consciousness that transcended the ego. His stance was not that of an irresponsible preacher, but of a curious explorer who sought to understand how these experiences could expand human understanding of itself and of reality. Watts argued that psychedelics, when used consciously, could offer a kind of temporary shortcut to transcendence, revealing the interconnectedness of all things and the illusion of fixed identity. He often recounted that, under their effects, the boundaries between subject and object disappeared, and the individual felt inseparably part of the universe, as if the veil separating the self from the whole had been torn. However, he always made a point of reminding that these experiences were temporary and should not be confused with permanent enlightenment. Psychedelics could show the door, but they did not replace spiritual practice, meditation, or the daily living of expanded awareness. This balanced view of psychedelia distinguished Watts from many of his contemporaries. While some advocated the indiscriminate use of these substances as a form of cultural revolution, he warned that true transformation did not occur only in flashes of perception, but in the ability to integrate these visions into daily life. For him, there was no point in having a glimpse of cosmic unity and then returning to routine with the same patterns of attachment, fear, and alienation. The expansion of consciousness had to translate into a real change of perspective, into a life more light-hearted, compassionate, and connected. Still, it is undeniable that Watts saw in psychedelic experiences a powerful potential to break through the barriers of Western thought, so confined to linear logic and its obsession with certainties. When speaking of LSD and other substances, he emphasized that their greatest value lay in showing that the reality we take as absolute may in fact be only a mental construction. They revealed that there are other modes of perception, other dimensions of human experience that do not fit into rational categories. For many of his listeners, these reflections were liberating, as they offered a new way of approaching spirituality and existence itself. In the end, Watts saw psychedelia as a metaphor for something greater, the search to transcend the ego and access broader states of consciousness. It was not the substance itself that mattered, but the openness to seeing life as flow, play, and interconnection. Psychedelic experiences were only one of many possible doors to this expansion, and he always reminded that the real spiritual work began when the effect ended, and the task remained of living the present with fullness. By integrating psychedelia into his thought, Alan Watts established himself as one of the great interpreters of mystical experience in the modern era, someone who knew how to translate transcendent visions into accessible language, inspiring generations to look beyond the prison of the ego and discover the vastness of consciousness. For Alan Watts, insecurity was not a flaw to be corrected, but the very essence of life itself. He often said that the desperate attempt to control the future is precisely what generates anguish, because the nature of existence is, by definition, uncertain. Yet instead of treating this condition as a burden, Watts transformed it into art, the art of embracing the unpredictable. His message was clear: life only becomes bearable when we stop fighting against its fluidity and allow ourselves to float with it, just as a boat follows the current instead of resisting the waters. This view clashed with Western mentality, deeply conditioned to seek stability, financial security, social guarantees, and long-term plans. Watts said that this attachment to the predictable creates a false sense of control because the universe does not submit to our projections. The very idea of security, he affirmed, is an illusion. There is no way to predict absolutely everything, and the insistence on trying makes us live in a constant state of anxiety. By recognizing that instability is inevitable, we can free ourselves from the prison of wanting guarantees for every step. Watts often used metaphors to make this idea clearer. One of his favorites was the image of the surfer. He does not control the waves, but learns to glide over them. The sea is unpredictable, and precisely because of that, the art of surfing exists. In the same way, living is surfing upon the unexpected. If we wait for calm, perfect waves, we will never enter the ocean of life. But if we accept chaos, we can find beauty in uncertainty. This metaphor revealed the heart of his philosophy. It is not absolute order that brings peace, but the acceptance of constant movement. This acceptance of insecurity was also a way to free people from the paralysis of fear. How many times do we fail to act, to love, or to explore new paths because we wait for everything to be guaranteed? Watts reminded us that this wait never ends, because the future never offers certainty. True courage, therefore, is not about eliminating fear, but about walking even in the face of uncertainty. He showed that life, when embraced in its impermanence, becomes more authentic, because we no longer try to control it as a predictable machine, but live it as an adventure. In the end, the art of insecurity is not resignation, but freedom. It is realizing that if nothing is guaranteed, everything is possible. The same instability that frightens also opens space for the new, the unexpected, and the everyday miracle. Alan Watts invited his audience to laugh at their own fear, to let go of the need for definitive answers, and to dive into the flow of life with lightness. For him, insecurity was not the enemy, but the necessary condition for the cosmic game of existence to continue. Alan Watts dedicated much of his life to interpreting and disseminating Taoism, an ancient Chinese tradition that values fluidity, naturalness, and harmony with the flow of the universe. For him, the Tao is not an anthropomorphic god or a rigid doctrine, but the fundamental principle that permeates everything, invisible, silent, yet eternal in its movement. The Tao is like the wind, unseen yet moving trees, clouds, and waves. It is the unwritten law that governs the rhythm of life and the seasons, the force that keeps the cosmos in balance without effort or imposition. Watts emphasized that to understand the Tao is not to intellectualize but to experience, to feel oneself as part of its flow, to perceive the invisible dance between opposites, and to realize that all resistance generates suffering. The invisible harmony of the Tao manifests in every aspect of life, according to Watts. He explained that human beings tend to fight against the natural flow of things, trying to force results or control events beyond their reach. This struggle generates tension, anxiety, and frustration. On the other hand, when we align with the Tao, we act with life instead of against it. Our movements become graceful, our decisions more intuitive, and our relationships more fluid. Watts emphasized that this harmony does not require passivity or inaction, but conscious and spontaneous action, known as wu wei, action without forced effort, allowing things to follow their natural course. Watts also connected Taoism to the perception of unity and interdependence. He explained that just as a tree does not struggle to be a tree and a wave does not try to be the ocean, we too are part of a greater system in which every action and choice reverberates in the whole. This vision expanded the individual's consciousness, showing that the obsessive pursuit of control and separation is illusory. Life flows in cycles, and happiness arises when we realize that we are an inseparable part of this continuous movement. By understanding the Tao, we learn to accept that change is constant, that death is as natural as birth, and that true wisdom lies in harmonizing with this invisible dance. In his lectures, Watts emphasized that the Tao is not dogma, but experience. It is not something to be studied only intellectually, but lived in practice, in breathing, in walking, in contemplating nature, in relationships. The invisible harmony reveals itself when we stop imposing our rigid ideas of how life should be and begin to perceive it as it is, complex, unpredictable, and perfect in its own rhythm. He invited his audience to observe the simplicity of the present, to recognize the beauty of the everyday, and to realize that by aligning with the Tao, even challenges become opportunities for learning and growth. Watts managed to translate ancient concepts in an accessible and poetic way, showing that Taoism is not a distant or abstract philosophy, but a living practice that teaches us to live with more lightness, presence, and sensitivity. For him, true enlightenment is not an extraordinary state achieved in isolated retreat, but the ability to recognize invisible harmony in every gesture, every moment, and every breath. This perception transforms ordinary life into something sacred, making daily reality feel like a continuous dance between movement and silence, action and surrender, being and flowing. For Alan Watts, meditation was not merely a ritualistic or spiritual practice, but the key to perceiving life in its totality, free from the distortions imposed by the ego and social expectations. He saw the human mind as often trapped in repetitive patterns of thought, worries about the future, regrets from the past, constant judgments and comparisons, and argued that the practice of full presence was essential to break free from these chains. Meditation, according to Watts, is the process of observing thoughts and feelings without identifying with them, recognizing them as passing phenomena, like clouds drifting across the sky, without trying to control them or cling to what arises. Watts made a point of emphasizing that meditation is not about suppressing the mind or reaching a mystical state, but about experiencing reality as it is. Mindfulness allows each moment to be felt in its fullness, without filters or interference from judgment. He stressed that when we become fully aware of the present moment, we discover that life is always enough. Fear and anxiety arise when we distance ourselves from the now, when we project desires and frustrations onto what has not yet happened or what has already passed. The practice of meditation, therefore, is not about creating something new, but about revealing what already exists, the pure consciousness that observes and perceives without attachment. A central point in Watts's explanations was the idea that meditation is both simple and paradoxical. There is no need for complicated techniques or sophisticated rituals. All that is required is attention and acceptance. However, the difficulty arises from the natural resistance of the mind, which constantly wants to plan, evaluate, and control. For this reason, Watts compared meditation to being in a boat floating on a river. There is no need to row against the current, but one must remain aware of the water, the movement, and the boat itself, allowing everything to flow without resistance. This metaphor illustrated how the practice transforms the individual's relationship with life, from constant struggle to conscious presence. Moreover, Watts linked meditation to the perception of interconnection. When mindfulness becomes a habit, the rigid boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve. He argued that the sense of separation is a mental construct that prevents us from perceiving the fundamental unity of all things. Through meditation, the understanding arises that thoughts, feelings, and perceptions do not belong solely to an isolated self, but are part of a greater, universal flow. This realization not only promotes inner serenity, but also increases compassion, as we understand that each being is an expression of the same flow of life. Finally, Alan Watts viewed meditation as a transformative practice that does not remain confined to the mat or meditation room, but extends into everyday life. Walking, listening, observing, conversing, and even working can become meditative acts when performed with full attention and presence. He insisted that true mastery does not lie in fleeing the world or seeking extraordinary states, but in being fully present in what is common, ordinary, and inevitable. Full awareness, therefore, is a gateway to inner freedom, revealing the richness and beauty that exist in every moment, transforming ordinary life into a profound and meaningful experience. Alan Watts approached life as a cosmic game, a continuous dance in which human consciousness often becomes lost in the illusion of the ego. For him, the ego is not a fixed or true entity, but a mental construct that arises from the attempt to define who we are and separate the individual from the whole. This illusory separation is the root of much suffering. By believing that we are isolated individuals struggling for survival and success, we create anxiety, competition, and alienation. Watts stated that by realizing the illusory nature of the ego, it becomes possible to play the game of life more lightly, without the constant need for control, approval, or comparison. The central metaphor he used to explain this perspective was that of the musician. Life is not something to be won or conquered, but something to be played like a melody. Just as a musician is not attached to the final note, but enjoys the rhythm and transitions, human beings should live by appreciating the flow of the moment without being imprisoned by the obsessive desire for results. The game of life, according to Watts, has no fixed goal. Its beauty lies in participation itself. This view directly confronted Western mentality, oriented toward goals, achievements, and rigid definitions of success. Watts also explored how the illusion of the ego influences the perception of happiness. Many believe that happiness depends on accumulating possessions, status, or external recognition, when in fact it arises when we free ourselves from identification with the ego and surrender to the natural flow of existence. The idea of winning or losing becomes irrelevant when we understand that life is not an objective competition, but a sensory experience, a constant movement between being and becoming. Suffering, therefore, is amplified when we insist on living as a separate ego, ignoring the interconnection that permeates all existence. Furthermore, Watts emphasized that awareness of the ego's illusion is not merely intellectual, but deeply experiential. He encouraged practices that integrated mind and body, such as meditation, mindfulness, observing nature, and even dance or music, which reveal the unity and flow inherent in life. By experiencing the dissolution of the ego, we realize that the I is not the absolute controller, but a temporary expression of the whole, a fleeting wave in the ocean of consciousness. This perception transforms the individual's relationship with the world from a state of tension and constant effort to one of lightness, creativity, and spontaneity. Ultimately, Alan Watts invited his listeners to face life with humor and lightness, understanding that the game of existence is fluid, unpredictable, and essentially playful. Recognizing the illusion of the ego does not mean self-annihilation, but realizing that the self is only a temporary character in the narrative of the universe. This understanding allows people to participate in life more fully, with less fear, less attachment, and greater openness to the beauty of the present. Life, in this sense, ceases to be a burden or a problem to be solved, and becomes a continuous dance, in which each step, each gesture, and each experience contributes to the eternal melody of existence. Alan Watts often explored the profound interconnection between human beings, nature, and the cosmos, arguing that the fragmented perception of reality is one of the main sources of suffering. For him, the separation between self and other, between humanity and nature, is illusory, created by the dualistic thinking that dominates the Western mind. This dualistic vision leads to exploitation, competition, and alienation, while the awareness of unity reveals that everything that exists is an expression of the same universal flow. Watts suggested that by contemplating nature, whether through a silent walk in the forest, observing the ocean, or simply watching the movement of clouds, we can experience an intuitive perception of this unity, where each being is simultaneously distinct and part of the whole. The universe, according to Watts, is not a cold machine or a hierarchical system dominated by rigid laws, but a continuous dance of energy and consciousness. He compared existence to an improvisational performance in which every element, from the smallest particle to the most distant stars, participates in an interdependent cosmic choreography. This vision dissolved the idea of absolute control or separation. We are not mere spectators, but active participants in a living process where every action reverberates across multiple levels of reality. Watts emphasized that when we understand this unity, everyday life, relationships, work, leisure, acquires deeper meaning, since everything is part of the same organic and interconnected movement. Moreover, Watts emphasized the importance of perceiving the cyclical nature of the universe. Seasons, cycles of growth and decline, the birth and death of beings and systems reflect patterns that repeat themselves on different scales, from the microscopic to the cosmic. Recognizing these cycles allows us to accept impermanence as something natural, not as a threat. He suggested that this understanding reduces anxiety and resistance, allowing life to be lived with greater harmony and balance. Death, just like birth, ceases to be feared when we understand that both are aspects of a continuous flow, transcending the limitations of individual time. Watts also connected this perception of cosmic unity to practical spirituality. He argued that the sensation of separation feeds the ego, which seeks security and identity through possessions, status, or fixed beliefs. By realizing that we are expressions of the same vital flow that permeates the universe, the need to control, compare, or compete diminishes. This awareness promotes compassion, generosity, and a deep sense of belonging, since we understand that the well-being of each part influences the whole. Thus, caring for nature, for other beings, and for ourselves becomes a natural practice of alignment with the universe. Finally, Alan Watts reminded that this experience of unity does not need to be abstract or inaccessible. Small moments of contemplation, mindfulness, and presence can awaken the perception of the universal flow. He encouraged curiosity and openness to the unexpected, suggesting that life reveals itself fully when we stop imposing limitations on experience and allow ourselves to flow with the natural rhythms of the world. The awareness of cosmic unity transforms each moment into an opportunity for harmony, joy, and understanding, connecting the individual to the eternity of the flow that creates, sustains, and dissolves the universe without effort, without haste, in a perfectly harmonious way. Alan Watts often challenged the traditional way of looking at life and death, proposing that both should not be seen as opposites, but as inseparable parts of the same continuous flow. For him, the fear of death is largely fueled by attachment to the ego and the illusion of control over one's destiny. He explained that human consciousness tends to identify with a separate self, creating the sensation that individual existence is limited and finite. This perception generates anxiety and resistance toward death, preventing people from living fully. Watts affirmed that by realizing the continuity and interconnection of life, death ceases to be a threat and becomes a natural process, an essential part of the cycle of the universe, like the rising of the sun or the flowing of a river. According to Watts, living in alignment with present awareness is the key to transcending the fear of death. Past and future are mental constructions that often steal attention from the present moment, creating regrets or unrealistic expectations. By focusing on the now, the individual discovers the fullness of life, which is not defined by achievements or the accumulation of experiences, but by the intensity with which each moment is perceived and lived. He compared life to playing a musical note. It is not the final note that matters, but the experience of each sound, each pause, each transition. This perspective transforms the relationship with existence itself, making every moment meaningful in its own right, without the need for external justifications. Watts also emphasized that death is not an interruption, but a transformation. The energy that sustains life continues to flow, even after the cessation of the individual physical form. This perspective reduces anxiety about the end of life, allowing people to face their own mortality with serenity and acceptance. He reminded that many Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism and Taoism, see death as a change of state, a passage into another aspect of the continuous flow of reality. This view is not only philosophical but deeply practical. By accepting death, we are able to live more authentically, free from fears and expectations that limit the potential of our experience. Furthermore, Watts addressed the eternity of the present as a fundamental principle for inner freedom. He suggested that time as perceived by the ego is illusory. Past and future exist only in the mind, while reality is continuously renewed in each moment. Full awareness reveals that the present is eternal, a point of convergence between all that has happened and all that will come. This perception transforms the way we interact with the world. Small actions, gestures, and choices gain profound value, as each moment is lived as a complete whole, full of potential and meaning. Finally, Alan Watts encouraged the acceptance of life in its totality, including birth, growth, decline, and death, as an act of understanding and love for the natural flow of existence. He saw life and death not as separate events, but as two faces of the same continuous phenomenon, interconnected with cosmic unity. By internalizing this perspective, the individual reaches a serenity that transcends fear, allowing each experience to be lived with depth, joy, and connection, transforming ordinary existence into a conscious dance with the eternal present, in perfect harmony with the universe that surrounds and sustains us. In the last block of his philosophy, Alan Watts focused on the transcendence of the ego as the path to a full life, free from fears and limitations imposed by the dualistic mind. He affirmed that rigid identification with the separate self creates internal barriers that generate anxiety, conflict, and suffering, making the individual a slave to their own mental constructs. By recognizing that the ego is only a temporary representation within a continuous flow of consciousness, one begins to experience life with greater lightness, fluidity, and freedom. Watts suggested that the transcendence of the ego is not the abandonment of individuality, but the understanding that the self is a momentary expression of the whole, a wave that emerges and returns to the universal ocean, participating in the cosmic rhythm without clinging to illusory limits. He used various metaphors to explain this practice: life as dance, existence as music, consciousness as a river. Each metaphor emphasized that living fully means moving with the flow, in harmony with the natural rhythms of the universe, and not against them. By releasing the need to control, justify, or possess, the individual connects with the spontaneity and creativity inherent in existence. This state of ego transcendence allows reality to be perceived more directly, without the rigid filters of judgment, fear, or competition. Life thus becomes an experience of constant flow, where each action is meaningful not because of results or achievements, but because of its own essence and impact in the present moment. Watts also pointed out that transcending the ego leads to the dissolution of the fear of death and the reduction of suffering caused by attachment and anxiety. When the ego ceases to be the absolute arbiter of experience, the individual feels safe, even in the face of impermanence, change, and loss. He observed that death, failure, and pain are no longer enemies, but natural elements of life's flow. The deep acceptance of reality as it is, without resistance or attempts at absolute control, transforms consciousness, allowing for a more harmonious and balanced life. Another central point is that ego transcendence opens space for genuine compassion and empathy. By perceiving the underlying unity of all beings, one comes to understand that others are not external or separate, but manifestations of the same vital flow. This perception changes the relationship with the world. Rivalry and isolation give way to collaboration, generosity, and authentic connection. Watts emphasized that these attitudes are not imposed moralities, but natural consequences of the perception that acting against the rhythms of the universe creates tension, while aligning with them generates harmony and joy. Finally, Alan Watts encouraged his followers to actively practice the art of living without fear, incorporating awareness of the present, perception of cosmic unity, and ego transcendence into all daily activities. He suggested that each gesture, each thought, and each interaction becomes an opportunity to experience freedom, lightness, and the depth of existence. True wisdom for Watts does not lie in accumulating intellectual knowledge, but in living consciously, connected and fluidly, in harmony with the universal flow, transforming each instant into a full, rich, and infinitely meaningful experience, where the ego ceases to be an obstacle and becomes a harmonious expression of the whole. This is the final block, concluding the complete script on Alan Watts, addressing his philosophy of life, the awareness of the present, the illusion of the ego, the cosmic unity, the acceptance of death, and personal transcendence.